Eleanor Vance, at 68 years of age, was an embodiment of cultivated precision. Her entire existence, for nearly 4 decades, had been a meticulously catalogued collection of first editions and rare manuscripts, both within the hushed, reverent confines of the town library where she served as head archivist, and within her own impeccably ordered cabin. Nestled deep on the very fringe of an ancient, whispering forest, her single-story home was not merely a dwelling. It was a sanctuary of profound silence, punctuated only by the soft, rhythmic turning of pages and the distant, almost liturgical murmur of the wind weaving through the towering pine and venerable oak trees. Since her sister and lifelong companion, Clara, had been tragically taken by a sudden illness a decade prior, Eleanor had consciously retreated further into the comforting predictability of her books. She found solace not in human interaction, but in the intricate narratives and quiet wisdom contained within leather-bound spines, their meticulously printed words a balm to her profound, unyielding grief. Clara, with her boisterous laughter and penchant for spontaneous adventure, had been the vibrant counterpoint to Eleanor's quiet meticulousness. With Clara gone, Eleanor had doubled down on order, convinced that in the absence of chaos, pain could also be kept at bay. She lived by an immutable, unbending principle, one she often quoted to errant library patrons: a place for everything, and everything in its place. This philosophy was not merely a guideline, it was a sacred creed etched into every polished surface, every perfectly aligned spine, every pristine curtain in her home. Her cabin was the physical manifestation of this unwavering belief. Custom-built bookshelves of rich, dark cherry wood lined every wall, floor to ceiling, their contents arranged with scholarly rigor, first by overarching subject, then meticulously by specific author, and finally, down to the granular detail of publication date. Antique furniture, inherited from generations of equally fastidious ancestors, gleamed under the soft, warm glow of carefully positioned lamplight, polished to a mirror-like sheen. Not a single speck of dust dared to settle upon a surface without swift eradication, nor a plump cushion stray by so much as an inch from its symmetrical perfection on the velvet settee. Eleanor's days flowed with a serene, almost monastic rhythm, a precisely brewed morning tea taken by the window, hours spent immersed in reading or meticulously archiving her ever-growing personal collection, a light, precisely prepared supper, and early to bed, the quiet stillness of the cabin a comfortable shroud. She cherished peace, quiet, and the undisturbed sanctity of her personal space, far removed from the unpredictable whims of the wild, which she viewed with a distant, academic appreciation from behind her window panes, rather than any intimate connection. It was a crisp, particularly vibrant autumn afternoon, the kind where the air tasted of turning leaves and the nostalgic scent of distant wood smoke, when the sacred, profound silence of Eleanor's world was irrevocably shattered. A strange, rhythmic, insistent thumping, followed by a low, guttural grunt of profound frustration, began to vibrate through the very floorboards beneath her feet. The sound emanated unmistakably from her garden shed, a sturdy, unpretentious wooden structure usually reserved for her neatly stacked firewood, her impeccably organized gardening tools, and the occasional winter squash harvest. Eleanor, her brow furrowed in a rare display of genuine perturbation, paused, her antique teacup hovering mid-air, its delicate porcelain trembling almost imperceptibly. She carefully set it down on its matching saucer, retrieved a sturdy garden broom, more for psychological comfort than actual defense, and approached the shed with the cautious, deliberate steps of a detective investigating a perplexing mystery. Her mind cycled through a rapid succession of possibilities, a particularly tenacious squirrel, perhaps. A very large, unusually noisy raccoon? She gripped the cold metal latch, her hand trembling slightly, and pulled open the heavy wooden shed door, peering into the gloom, where a single, defiant sliver of sunlight cut through the dancing dust motes. There, amidst her perfectly stacked kindling, looking profoundly out of place, was a small, sooty black bundle of fur. It certainly wasn't a raccoon. It was a bear cub, no bigger than a well-fed Labrador, its dark, intelligent eyes wide with a startling mixture of raw terror, innate defiance, and an almost comical indignation. It let out a sharp, frustrated humph. Humph growl, a sound that seemed less like a cry for help and more like a direct, personal scolding, as if Eleanor herself were personally responsible for its dire, self-inflicted predicament. One of her antique garden spades lay bent on the dirt floor, its pristine blade twisted, a testament to the cub's desperate, yet ultimately futile, efforts to escape its accidental imprisonment. It seemed less distressed by its injuries, which appeared to be minor scrapes, and more profoundly annoyed by its inability to manipulate the shed's stubborn latch. Eleanor, a woman whose voice rarely rose above a polite murmur, let out a small, involuntary gasp. A bear? In her shed. The sheer audacity of the situation, the violation of her meticulously ordered domain, momentarily stunned her. Her first, rational, librarian-like thought was protocol: close the door, secure the latch, and immediately call the wildlife authorities. But then the cub let out another rumble, a deeply resonant complaint that vibrated through the wooden floor and into Eleanor's very bones, demanding not just attention, but an immediate, decisive solution. It looked less injured and more, profoundly, desperately hungry. And very, very put out. Against every ingrained instinct she possessed, against every rule of order and propriety that had governed her life for decades, Eleanor found herself stepping inside the shed, the broom forgotten. "Well, you are quite the pickle, aren't you?" she murmured, the words feeling foreign and slightly absurd on her tongue, yet carrying an unexpected softness. With surprising agility, considering her age and the sheer absurdity of the situation, she managed to unlatch the shed's small, high window, pushing it open to create an obvious escape route. The cub, however, didn't bolt. It eyed the window, then Eleanor, then the splintered spade, before letting out a mournful, drawn-out hue-off. As if asking for assistance, or perhaps an explanation for her perceived delay in remedying its situation. It was a tiny, defiant anarchist, utterly unapologetic in its presence, and something in its sheer, unmitigated audacity, in its stubborn persistence, stirred a tiny, unfamiliar flicker of amusement deep within Eleanor. She found herself smiling, a genuine, unforced smile. She named him Bramble, a name suggested by the thick thorn bushes he'd likely navigated before getting trapped, and a fitting tribute to his utterly charming, if entirely problematic, demeanor. Over the next few weeks, Bramble became the most chaotic, yet strangely charming, resident Eleanor had ever known. He was less injured, his scrapes healing quickly, and more simply, lost, profoundly hungry, and bursting with an insatiable, wild curiosity that knew no bounds. Eleanor, with hands accustomed to turning delicate pages and polishing intricate porcelain, now found herself meticulously mixing specialized formula for bear cubs, consulting hastily downloaded guides on her ancient desktop computer, her usually formal posture often bent over a steaming bowl of mush. She quickly learned to recognize his incessant humph as a demand for food or attention, or perhaps just a general commentary on the deplorable state of his environment, her very pristine cabin. She began leaving out bowls of wild berries and nuts collected from the forest edge, observing with a mixture of exasperation and grudging fascination as Bramble devoured them with gusto, leaving an inevitable trail of crumbs, sticky juice, and smeared paw prints. She maintained a stern facade, tooting loudly at the mud Bramble tracked onto her polished hardwood floors and sighing dramatically at the scattering of firewood he managed to dislodge from the shed in his tireless explorations. But secretly, a small, involuntary smile would tug at her lips when he would attempt to help her dust, merely batting at the dust rag with an enormous, clumsy paw, or when he would investigate a newly delivered parcel with intense sniffs and playful grunts, as if it held the very secrets of the universe. Bramble's defining trait, beyond his persistent appetite and general noisiness, was his profound, almost theatrical, talent for chaos, especially when it involved her beloved books. He seemed inexplicably drawn to her towering bookshelves, viewing them less as repositories of profound knowledge and more as intriguing climbing frames or perhaps culinary opportunities. The first major incident occurred on an afternoon when Eleanor had left the living room for a mere moment to fetch her reading spectacles. She returned to find Bramble perched precariously on a low shelf, one enormous, clumsy paw splayed over a cherished first edition of Pride and Prejudice, his nose buried deep in a jar of her homemade blueberry jam, leaving sticky, purple smears across the delicate, yellowed pages. He looked up, jam-smeared muzzle and bright, innocent eyes wide with satisfaction, before letting out a deeply contented MMMGRMPH, as if to proclaim his bookish snack a triumph of culinary exploration. Eleanor nearly fainted from the sheer horror and shock, then found herself stifling a shocked giggle, a rusty but genuine sound that brought an unfamiliar lightness to her chest, a joy she hadn't felt in a decade. Other incidents followed, each more elaborate and destructive than the last. A meticulously balanced stack of National Geographic magazines became an irresistible mountain for him to conquer, resulting in an avalanche of glossy pages that fanned across the floor like scattered autumn leaves. A rare, leather-bound volume on ancient botany acquired a series of curious, almost artistic, chew marks along its spine. Eleanor, despite her initial horror, found herself adapting with surprising ingenuity. She began moving smaller or more precious items to higher, unreachable shelves, covering certain vulnerable areas with old blankets, and even installing makeshift barriers that often proved futile against Bramble's determined ingenuity. It was a silent acknowledgement of her new, furry roommate's anarchic tendencies, a reluctant surrender of her rigid order to the beautiful, unpredictable chaos of a wild creature. The lines between what was her space and a Bramble's blurred with each passing day. Word spread quickly through their small, tightly knit community that Miss Eleanor Vance, the meticulous librarian, had taken in a bear cub. Reactions were varied, ranging from polite concern, "Are you quite sure that's safe, Eleanor dear? Bears can be unpredictable," to outright disbelief, "A bear? In her house? Has Eleanor finally lost her mind?" Ranger Ben, the local wildlife officer, was the first official visitor, arriving with a mixture of professional duty and barely concealed curiosity. Ben was a man as rugged and practical as Eleanor was refined, his hands scarred from forest work, his face weathered by sun and wind. He was skeptical but professional, providing Eleanor with detailed guidance on cub care and rehabilitation protocols, leaving behind thick binders of information. "Remember, Miss Vance," he stated during his first visit, his voice serious. Observing Bramble attempting to vigorously gnaw on one of Eleanor's antique chair legs with alarming gusto, "He's a wild animal. The ultimate goal is always to return him to his kind. We want to minimize human imprinting." He'd surveyed the subtle but growing chaos in her formerly pristine living room, a smudge on the wall near a freshly gnawed baseboard, a slightly askew rug, and found himself stifling a chuckle, a flicker of genuine amusement in his usually serious eyes. Eleanor, to her own surprise, found herself defending Bramble's more egregious acts, claiming they were merely learning experiences or necessary explorations of his environment, her voice taking on a maternal defensiveness she hadn't known she possessed. As the weeks turned into a crisp early winter, Bramble grew stronger, more robust, his huffs and grunts becoming more assertive, his waddles more confident, his clumsy charm evolving into a more deliberate mischief. Eleanor found herself talking to him constantly, narrating her daily tasks. Now, Bramble, we must polish the brass. No chewing the polish rag, recounting passages from her beloved classics aloud. It is a truth universally acknowledged, that a single bear in possession of good fortune must be in want of a snack. To her astonishment, Bramble seemed to listen, occasionally letting out a low, grumble purr as she turned the pages, his huge head resting against her leg, his eyes half closed in what seemed like profound contentment. The quiet solitude of her cabin was gone, replaced by a lively, unpredictable rhythm that, to her surprise, she found herself craving. Her neatly organized books sometimes had bent corners, and there was often a faint scent of forest earth and damp fur on her rugs, but the rigid order she'd so carefully constructed had begun to yield to something more vital, more alive. She even caught herself laughing, truly laughing, a rusty but joyful sound that brought an unfamiliar warmth and lightness to her usually reserved home. The profound loneliness that had settled deep within her after Clara's passing began to recede, little by little, replaced by the demanding, joyous, utterly present presence of the little bear. Bramble developed several unique quirks that endeared him further to Eleanor. He possessed an inexplicable fascination with Eleanor's reading glasses, often attempting to snatch them from her face with a surprisingly swift paw, then batting at them playfully on the floor. He also seemed to enjoy watching his own reflection in the polished glass of the antique hutch, nudging his nose against it, as if trying to play with the other bear, a curious contrast to some bears' fear of mirrors. On one particularly quiet, melancholy afternoon, Eleanor found herself weeping softly, a sudden, overwhelming wave of grief for Clara cresting over her. Bramble, who had been napping by the warmth of the wood stove, stirred. He lumbered over to her, pushing his large head into her lap, letting out a soft, sympathetic "ehue-off," and gently nudging her hand with his wet nose. His silent, empathetic comfort was a balm Eleanor hadn't realized she desperately needed, a simple, pure connection that transcended words. The arrival of the first snowfall transformed the forest into a breathtaking, pristine wonderland. Bramble, seeing snow for the first time, reacted with boundless, joyous energy. He'd roll in it, nosedive into drifts, and then track melting snow and mud across Eleanor's carefully swept floors. His curiosity wasn't limited to the indoors. He'd spend hours at the windows, watching the squirrels bury nuts, sniffing the air, his ears twitching at distant sounds. Eleanor often found herself observing him, learning more about the rhythms of the wild than any book had ever taught her. Ranger Ben continued his weekly visits, bringing supplies and conducting health checks. He'd often stay for a cup of tea, observing the subtle ways Eleanor was changing. "He's good for you, Miss Vance," he once commented, watching her playfully scold Bramble for attempting to chew on the leg of her dining table, a genuine smile on his face. "Brings a bit of life to the old place." Eleanor merely sniffed, but a warmth spread through her chest. As winter deepened, Bramble suffered a minor setback, a persistent cough that worried Eleanor intensely. Ranger Ben quickly diagnosed it as a mild respiratory infection, common in cubs not yet fully adapted to the harsh cold. For 3 days, Eleanor barely slept, administering medicine, fretting over his dwindling appetite. She spoke to him constantly, soothing him, reading stories of brave little animals from her children's collection. It was during these feverish nights, with Bramble curled weakly against her side, that Eleanor fully acknowledged the depth of her attachment. This wasn't just a duty, it was love, fierce and undeniable. The community, hearing of Bramble's illness through Ranger Ben, sent small gifts, honey from the Petersons, a soft, knitted blanket from Martha Hawthorne. These gestures of quiet support, initially surprising, began to form a new, unexpected fabric in Eleanor's life. Spring arrived, painting the Blue Ridge in vibrant greens and exploding blossoms. Bramble, now a sturdy juvenile, was a whirlwind of energy. His antics had grown proportionally more disruptive. He could now open kitchen cupboards with surprising dexterity, his target usually the pantry where Eleanor stored her dried fruits and nuts. She found a complex system of latches and ropes to bear-proof them, turning her kitchen into a labyrinth worthy of an escape room. He loved chasing butterflies on the porch, his heavy paws surprisingly light as he pounced, usually missing by a comical margin. But his wild instincts were also becoming sharper. He spent long stretches at the windows, his ears swiveling, his nose twitching, listening to the murmurs of the forest, sounds Eleanor couldn't discern. He would respond to distant bird calls, his own huffs and growls taking on a new, more resonant quality. The impending separation loomed larger with each passing day. Ranger Ben, observing Bramble's increased size and independence, confirmed Eleanor's fears. "He's reaching the optimal age, Miss Vance," he said gently one afternoon, as Bramble attempted to climb a small sapling in the yard, his muscles flexing powerfully. "His natural instincts are strong. We've got a window now, before he becomes too habituated, or before the wild bears see him as too much of a stranger." The phrase, "too habituated," felt like a knife twisting in Eleanor's heart. She knew Ben was right. Her love for Bramble meant letting him go. She spent his last weeks showering him with his favorite treats, reading aloud more than ever, letting him help with chores. Or rather, supervising his chaotic attempts, allowing him to chew on old, non-valuable books, a special Bramble's library she designated for his destructive pleasure. The pain of the looming separation was a constant, dull ache, but beneath it, a new strength had blossomed, forged in the fires of unexpected love. The morning of his release was cold and still, the air sharp with the promise of true winter, but tinged with the scent of pine and damp earth. Ranger Ben arrived in his truck, a specially designed carrier in the back. Eleanor, her heart heavy, carried a large basket filled with Bramble's favorite wild treats, extra berries, a generous portion of nuts, and even a small, jam-smeared piece of bread, a final, nostalgic nod to his first, famous act of culinary rebellion. They drove deep into a secluded, densely forested area, miles from any human settlement, a place Ranger Ben assured her was ideal for a bear's reintroduction, with abundant food sources and an existing, healthy bear population. Eleanor knelt on the damp forest floor, her hands trembling as she opened the basket. Bramble, sensing the vastness of the forest, the freedom, paused. He looked at her with those intelligent, mischievous eyes, his large nose twitching as he took in the complex tapestry of scents of true wilderness. He took a tentative bite of the jam bread, looking back at her one last time with a soft, questioning rumph. That tugged at Eleanor's soul. "Be safe, my dear Bramble," she whispered, stroking his thick, healthy fur one last time, her voice thick with unaccustomed emotion. "Be wild. Be free. You belong out here." He finished the bread, licked his muzzle with a final, contented mrumph, turned, and ambled into the trees, his stocky form disappearing into the shadows as gracefully as a phantom. He didn't look back. Eleanor watched until he was utterly gone, swallowed by the boundless green, a profound quiet settling over the forest, a painful, deafening mirror of the quiet that now returned to her cabin and to her heart. Ranger Ben quietly placed a comforting hand on her shoulder. The cabin was, once again, impeccably ordered. The books were back on their shelves, every one accounted for, the floors gleamed, and the silence was unbroken by huffs or clumsy waddles. But it wasn't the same. Eleanor still read, but her eyes would often drift to the window, scanning the forest edge with a new, keen interest. She started a new journal, no longer just of book reviews, but of meticulous nature observations. The precise flight path of a robin, the rustle of leaves that hinted at unseen creatures, the distant, echoing call of a hawk. Her heart, once a carefully closed vault, now held a spacious, warm chamber, filled not with emptiness, but with the vibrant, chaotic memory of a demanding, messy, utterly wild bear cub. She felt lighter, more connected to the world around her, her profound grief for Clara softened not by forgetting, but by the unexpected joy of new, fierce love. Her rigorous routines still existed, but they were infused with a subtle softness. She might leave an apple on her porch for forest visitors, or linger by the window, listening to the wind, not just as a sound, but as a living breath. Her conversations with Ranger Ben grew more frequent and personal, a new, unexpected friendship blooming in the silence Bramble left behind. Sometimes, on particularly quiet evenings, when the first snowflakes began to fall, painting the world in fresh white, she would swear she heard a faint, distant huff-rumble carried on the wind, a secret, mischievous reminder of the bear cub who had, without trying, shown a meticulous librarian that life's most precious stories weren't always bound in leather and ink, but lived out, wildly and joyfully, in the heart of the forest. Her world was still ordered, yes, but now, it also contained the beautiful, unpredictable magic of the wild, a wildness she now carried within herself.